Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we tackle the counterfactuals of some of the most popular peoples in history, the Vikings. In the 10th century, Norse colonists began settling in Greenland, where they found surprising success in some far northern reaches, before making landfall in North America. The settlements had all faded away by 1400, but what might have happened if it all went differently? Find out on today's episode. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
The Vikings are probably best known for their raiding, but also for their passion for the sea and exploration. In the Viking Age, Norsemen sailed all across the North Atlantic. They raided down the west coast of Europe. They settled in France and created Normandy. In England, years of conflict led to Norse settlement and culture. From Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, they sailed across the Baltic Sea and established settlements along its shores, and they sailed west and settled numerous islands, including Iceland, and eventually Greenland. You've probably heard of Eric the Red. He's probably one of history's most famous Vikings, and in many ways he lived the life of a normal Viking, except he established a reputation for himself and his family that is so powerful that people still recognize his name more than 1,000 years after his time. He established the first permanent settlements in Greenland and, indirectly, the first recorded landing by Europeans on American shores. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Eric Thorvaldsson, later to get the nickname the Red, was born around 950 AD to Thorvald Avaldsson in Norway. When he was about 10 years old, his father was banished from Norway, apparently because he'd killed another Norseman. Fortunately for a 10th century Norseman, there were other lands filled with Norsemen where he could migrate, and he chose to take his family to Iceland, which had been settled by the Norse beginning around 874. Much of the best land had already been settled, but Thorvald was able to find a suitable place to build his home on the island's northernmost peninsula, Hornstrandir, which lies very near the Arctic Circle. Here Thorvald was able to successfully make a life for his family. He died before 980. Eric grew up in inhospitable and cold but beautiful land, far from large cities. It's possible he may have even seen Greenland from here, a feat made possible only by a mirage called the Hillinger effect, in which temperature inversion at the Earth's surface bends light in a way that lifts the image of something below the horizon into view. At high points in northwestern Iceland, it may have been possible for him to see the lands that lay so far distant. It isn't historically clear whether he saw this mirage or not, although Norsemen would have certainly been familiar with the way such mirages can obscure distance. Eric married and moved south, settling and building a new house for himself and his wife. The land he settled may have belonged to his wife's family. It was here that his son, who would rival Eric for historical fame, was born. Archaeologists have excavated what they believe to be the site of Eric's house, where a reconstructed longhouse and an open-air museum now stand. Much of what we know about Eric and his family comes from two Norse sagas that were written some 200 years after the events were supposed to have occurred: the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. By the late 10th century, the age of the Vikings was coming to an end, and the Norse were no longer spending as much time raiding settlements and returning to their homelands in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Norsemen turned instead to a different, equally lucrative activity: business. No other culture had the skills, the navy, or the sheer network that the Norse mariners had built by settling across the North Atlantic. The Norse had always been farmers, and usually went raiding during breaks from crops. Eric and his wife had at least 4 children and seemed to have prospered. They owned at least a few thralls, a kind of slave or serf or kind of servant. These thralls seem to have caused the first of Eric's run-ins with Norse law. While doing some kind of work, Eric's thralls had caused a landslide that did damage to a neighboring homestead. The thralls were killed for the damage, and Eric in turn retaliated by attacking the killer and killing both him and another. Like his father before him, the settlement ordered him banished. The worst kinds of banishings in Norse law involved the forfeiting of property and could even make the banished an outlaw who could be killed without repercussion. Eric probably earned his nickname because he had red hair, but it is possible that he also earned it because of his short temper. After being exiled, he chose to settle off the island of Oxney, part of a grouping of islands that sits near Iceland's coast. While he worked on building a new house, he entrusted some of his most prized possessions to a friend and fellow settler, Thorjest. These were large wooden beams covered in intricate Norse symbols, brought by his father from Norway and left to his son. These kinds of beams were held in high regard and were of considerable religious, symbolic, and personal value. When he finished his house, he returned to collect the beams, only to find, according to the saga, that they could not be obtained. It isn't clear what happened to the beams, but Eric quickly decided to take some by force. Whether they were his or belonged to Thorjest isn't clear in the saga. Eric apparently expected that Thorjest would follow, and so waited for it. When he arrived with a band of armed men, Eric and his own men attacked, killing several of Thorjest's sons and others. Both then fortified their houses and assembled as many men as possible, ready to escalate the dispute. Instead of resorting to more bloodshed, the men eventually turned to the Norse law, which involved assembling all the local men for discussion at what was called a thing. All free men of age could participate in the decision-making, which ultimately banished Eric yet again for 3 years. His family was allowed to keep his land and possessions, and to take care of it while he kept himself occupied until he could return. According to Icelandic tradition, Eric was not the first Norseman to lay his eyes on Greenland. That honor belonged to Gunborn Ulfsson, who was blown off course during a trip to Iceland. He claims to have seen islands in the distance, which would become known as Gunborn's Skerries. Some Norsemen attempted to settle on these islands around 970, but the colony failed. They were apparently a popular stop on later trips to Greenland, and settlements did exist later, although the location of the islands isn't certain, as in 1456 they were apparently burned up, destroyed by some kind of volcanic eruption. Eric decided that he would spend his banishment doing something useful by taking his men and exploring the nearby waters around Iceland. They heard of the landmass that lay beyond Iceland, likely from stories of Gunborn and others, and hoped to sail west and discover the lands for themselves. Perhaps even then, Eric hoped to find a new place he could settle after the scandal with Thorjest. The distance between Iceland and Greenland is at least 180 miles. The east coast of Greenland was not terribly inviting, and he couldn't find a good place to land. So they followed the coast south until they passed the southern tip, now known as Cape Farewell, until they found a place they could make landfall on the western side of the island. When he arrived, he found the island deserted. While there were likely ruins and remains of much earlier pre-Inuit people who had lived in the area nearly 2,000 years before. At the time, the only people living on the island seemed to have been far to the north. Eric and his men spent their first winter on the island that he named Eric's Island. In the spring, they began exploring, sailing in a nearby fjord, which he named Eric's Fjord. What they found was rich, arable land and fields where they could graze their livestock. Over the next 3 years, he traveled along the coast, exploring the newfound land, finding plenty of good coastline where Norse could settle, and, well, little else. He may have traveled thousands of miles by boat in this time, coming across many of the things that made Greenland a good site for a colony, especially walrus for their tusk and animals like the Arctic fox and polar bear with valuable pelts. Eric named a lot of locations on his first trip, often after himself. Despite the island's abundant ice, he chose to call the new island Greenland, according to the saga of Eric the Red, because men will desire much more to go there if the land has a good name. Sometime in 985 or 986, his term of banishment ended, and he returned with his ship to Oxney, where his family had been dutifully working the soil and taking care of the house. Eric had decided that he wanted to take his family to Greenland, but the job of building a new colony wasn't one he could take on alone. He spent the winter talking people into traveling with him to establish their new colony. It isn't certain who else went with him, but ultimately he seems to convince some 300 people that Greenland was going to be a winning bet. The sagas implied that those Vikings living on poor land in Iceland were the families that chose to follow him, as well as those who had suffered from a recent famine. The first recorded famine in Iceland was in 976. The following summer, the fleet set off with at least 25 ships, of which only 14 eventually reached Eric's Fjord. Eric, who seems to have struggled to fit in with society in Iceland, turned out to be a good leader for the colony. They successfully established 2 colonies in Greenland, the first called the Eastern Settlement, which was the largest and where Eric made his home, and the smaller Western Settlement, which sat close to the modern-day capital of Greenland, Nuuk. Both settlements were not set along the coast, but miles inland, where they had some protection from the wind and sea. One issue the settlers ran into was Greenland's lack of trees. For the Norse, trees were a vital supply, both for building their low longhouse homes and for building ships. In Greenland, they built with stone. The eastern settlement sat at the end of Eric's fjord, and he built himself a house there that he called Steep Slope. He became the paramount chief of the eastern settlement and seems to have finally found his place in the world. If he killed any other Norsemen, it isn't reported. The settlement survived by trading the rare and valuable goods like ivory and polar bear pelts back to Europe, where they could in turn retrieve boats, timber, and other necessary supplies. They farmed and raised livestock, traded back to Iceland and Norway. Eric's settlements grew, holding at least 2,500 people and likely more. They survived for around 500 years before declining and disappearing for as yet uncertain reasons. Possible explanations include the intervention of the Little Ice Age, declining quality of the soil, conflict with the native Inuit, who they met sometime in the 13th century, and the falling value of walrus ivory and Arctic pelts. Eric's contributions to world history amount to more than the first permanent European settlements in Greenland. His second son is just as recognizable as him, if not more so. Leif Erikson is now credited with the first European visit to mainland North America. The two sagas tell slightly different versions of how Leif reached modern Canada. In the Saga of the Greenlanders, Leif first hears about the land to the west of Greenland when a fellow Norseman named Bjarni accidentally sights land after being blown off course trying to reach Greenland. Noting that there are no glaciers, he determines that this land isn't Greenland and sails on. According to the saga, Leif asks his father to lead an expedition to the new land, but Eric's horse stumbles on the way to the ship and Eric injures his foot. "It is not ordained that I should discover more countries than that which we now inhabit," his father says, and sends his son out alone. Leif comes to be known as Leif the Fortunate, or Leif the Lucky. He set out to follow Bjarni's journey in reverse, visiting in turn Heluland, Markland, and finally Vinland. The various locations have never been certainly identified, although Heluland, meaning stone slab land, may refer to Baffin Island. Leif spends some time in Vinland, so named because of the discovery of grapes. Some have identified La Omedo, the only certain site of Norse in North America, as the place of his landing, although he may have misidentified some kind of berries as grapes, which mostly grow further south. The Greenlanders saga then relates several more trips to Vinland by Leif's brothers of varying success. In the saga of Eric the Red, it is Leif who discovers the new continent, returning to Greenland after spending some time with Norwegian King Olaf I, who charged Leif with spreading Christianity to Greenland. Blown off course, he spends the winter in Vinland before returning home. Another group, led by other Greenlanders and Leif's brothers and sister, then traveled to Vinland, where they are eventually chased out by the locals, who they call Skraeling. The sagas that tell these histories are written versions of oral history that were only written down hundreds of years after the events that they describe, but archaeology and further study suggest that much of it is true, at least the part about settlements in Greenland and Norse landings in Vinland. And it's possible that there were many other settlements and many other Norsemen in North America whose sagas didn't get written down and are now lost to history. But what is clear is that Eric's settlements in Greenland represented the western end of a trade route that went all the way from the Arctic Circle to Europe, a connection between pre-Inuit peoples and the castles of medieval Europe. And it's perhaps fitting that it occurred in true Viking fashion because of two things: boats and people who couldn't control their temper. Because, of course, if Eric hadn't killed other Norsemen, then perhaps Leif never would have come to North America.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, discuss what might have happened if all of this went a little differently. Okay. So today we're talking about Vikings, and we watched an episode specifically about Eric the Red, but there are a lot of different directions that Vikings can go. So I think this is shaping up to be a very interesting episode.
It is, though, with Vikings, you're already starting off with a counterfactual, because most of what we know come from sagas, which were often written hundreds of years after the events were supposed to have occurred, sometimes are conflicting with each other, are vague in places where you'd wish they weren't, always leaving you wondering whose saga did not get written and who was trying to sell something with the saga that did. And so it's interesting because we're already counterfactual even when we start here. But it's the only archaeologically verifiable visit by Vikings to North America was found. It was archaeologically found through the Vinland saga. So I mean, they can actually be respectfully accurate. But on the other hand, I don't know how many people got locked in their longhouse and set fire to, but it seems like more than would reasonably have occurred if you were to listen to.
Having read the Heimskringla in
Yeah,
several of the sagas, it seemed to be more or less a weekly event.
it
So
did. Yeah, don't
I'm
go
not sure
inside.
that I'm, I'm really not sure if this is an indication that it was just the most sensational story that got applied to the accidental, air quotes, demise of an entire family and or household, and it just sounded good for the equivalent of the penny dreadfuls or dime comics of the era, or whether in fact it was actually kind of a cultural norm that if you got angry enough at someone that
Yeah, that's how you got rid of the local warlord. You locked the door and set fire to the place. Yeah. You have to take them like other oral histories. You have to assume that there's lessons to be taught here, and that some of it is purely symbolic. And so we're already counterfactual with what we think we know about the Norse. But I mean, that still has given us a extraordinary record. Yeah.
There's certainly been a lot of academic study on the sagas, and people have differing opinions on which parts are true and which parts are fictional. And except for, say, mentions, there's only a handful of mentions of Vinland elsewhere in outside of the sagas. And of course, for a long time, I think that it was essentially believed to be completely mythical. Or unlikely, except that now we found that one site, and it makes you think, if we find one, that probably means there are at least dozens of others that for whatever reason don't survive into the archaeological record, whether they're not built as big as the one at Alonso Meadows, or if it's under the water now, which happens to a lot of stuff that's going to be on the shore. I mean, it makes you think that there probably was some more connection than just the one. It seems unlikely that we found 100% of the of the visits to North America there.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, there's lots to question about the sagas and how they tell those stories, and it's hard to know exactly. I mean, some of the people in those stories they tend to think are totally fake, and some of the stories, I mean, like Leif's sister Freya Freydis, I think, is often considered to be a completely a literary invention, and her story does seem a little more, perhaps, literary than some of them. Yeah. But they all have a literary.
I think that kind of plays flavor into a portion of the show I'd like to call "Let's Talk About Some Myths." So Vikings wearing horned helmets. Yes, we all know that's pretty silly, but there are some others that I think are far more persistent. And one of the ones we were discussing pre-show was, did Vikings look like biker gangs with tribal and runic tattoos from head to toe?
That's a good question. And I honestly don't know if there's an archaeology to explain that. I don't. What do you think? Did Vikings look like biker gangs?
The literary evidence is from an Arab diplomat who met a trading delegation of the Rus who were coming down the Volga. And the Rus at this point were essentially Swedish Vikings who traveled up and down the Volga. And he claimed that they were tattooed from fingertip to hairline. So there is a literary reference to it, but it seems to be the only one. The archaeology is really tough because even though the archaeology of Viking sites has given us leaps and bounds of just more knowledge than we've ever had before of the Viking era, skin just tends to break down too quickly. So actually finding an extant cadaver with tattoos on it has not happened at this point. And all of the other sagas and chronicles of the time, you would assume that if tattooing was the norm, that those who were getting raided by the Vikings would have added, not only were they, devils 12 feet tall, breathing fire and breaking down the door of every abbey, but they have strange arcane symbols that clearly show they are spawn of the devil, or something to that effect. So the jury's still out on it. At this point, it's conjecture. It's like, they might have, but there's very little evidence to actually support it.
We know that it was that there was tattooing practiced at that time. We just don't know if it was. It's difficult to know if the Vikings themselves were
another myth
doing that.
Is interesting, I think, is that they've actually gone through and studied grave sites, and the Vikings were not particularly tall people. Contemporaneously, they were described usually as very tall, but they actually are more or less in line with the rest of Europe.
See, and that is interesting. And is that just? I mean, I guess you can explain it at least partially as they're just afraid. You're afraid of the vicious people coming through your, and you imagine them as large. But maybe it's that also they were so terrifying that you'd prefer
it's hard to say too how much they came as raiders, how much they came as traders. I mean, there's at the Meadows, there's every suggestion that they abandoned when they ran into armed conflict with the natives, which suggests that they maybe weren't as fierce warriors as they say that they are, or that they didn't want to choose conflict. So, but I mean, yeah, if this is someone who's raiding, who's taking your land, who's showing up by the boatload like they did in England, you can see how they might get a reputation for being particularly large individuals. Yeah. Even if it wasn't necessarily the case.
It is interesting because you would think, based on what we know, and we know remarkably little about, what the Native Americans around 1000 AD would have looked like, and who we only know a little bit about who they would have been. But you would think that the Vikings would have had a significant technological advantage in terms of their weaponry, because probably they're using.
Yeah, they did have a forge there, yeah.
And that the natives would not have been using metal. But on the other hand, an arrow can be just as deadly.
Can be. Well, it was not a large encampment, so
no.
they never apparently had a great deal of people there. But if it was primarily built there in order to collect timber, I mean, then they might not have been a military force. They might have been more of a domestic force. It might not have taken them, of course, too. I mean, imagine living.
Yeah.
Just try to see. It's not warm, so I mean, it might not take a lot to say, well, fine, yeah, I like this neighborhood all that much anyway.
Well, and we are a ways after the kind of the legendary Viking age of the Vikings had settled more, or the people we understand, that we call Vikings, had somewhat settled to be less raiders, more traders by 1000 AD. And that's also, I mean, essentially why all the Greenland settlements existed, was that they were trading stuff to Europe, and it seems like when that trade started to dry up, so did the settlements.
Because you're always talking about how this is all alternative history to start with. It is interesting because we know they had 2 settlements in Greenland, and we know that they just disappeared, both the western and eastern settlement. And there's lots of reasons to think why. One of those being that now there was an ivory supply coming from Africa that was much larger, and so their trade in walrus tusks was no longer profitable. But the thing is, the sagas tell us about them going. They occasionally talk about someone who came back, but the sagas don't explain what happened to the Greenland colonies, which would have been a few thousand individuals. And that's, again, so you don't know what's left out of the saga. You don't know what saga was forgotten or what saga wasn't written, or maybe they all hopped in 10 boats and they all got blown out to sea. I mean, that could have happened. But I mean, there's a lot we don't know there. So we can guess. I mean, there's lots of guessing about why they abandoned Greenland. But one of the interesting things is we don't know where they went.
No.
And so that really does tell us what the gap is. But it gives lots of room for counterfactuals. I mean, the assumption is that they came back to Iceland or something like that. But I mean, what if they did go west? What if they did go farther than we realized, and we just haven't discovered the archaeology yet? And what if there was more than the Meadows? What if what if it went much farther down? And so it does give you a lot of room, of course, and that leads to this big question, because people will tell you, especially in this we're in an anti-Columbus age, I think everybody can safely say, and so you will hear very much, Vikings were in America before Columbus, but of course you can't compare the two. I mean, the Vikings apparently forgot that they went there, and apparently only very lightly touched North America. Yeah. But what if, like Columbus, what if they had stayed? What if they had truly connected Europe to the New World? And how different would the contact between the old world and the new? How different would the colonization be? How different would North America be if, when Columbus showed up, if there were Viking colonies, Norse colonies all the way down to Florida? And that's an interesting question, especially since there's a possibility that a couple of thousand Vikings that had reason to abandon Greenland might have chosen to go west, and we just don't know what happened to them. But I mean, it shows a potential that there could have been, instead of what might have been something that was occupied for maybe 10 years out of 30 on a seasonal basis, which is kind of what we got now. What if there had been a Virginia-like colony or a Plymouth-like colony of Vikings first, and they had a much higher contact with North America? And that's one of the really fun questions when you ask about counterfactuals with the Vikings, is if you really could make the case, not just that the Vikings had touched North America first, but what if they touched it in the way that Columbus did? I mean, yes, the language might be different. Maybe Scandinavia, maybe Norway and the Norse would have been much more important in Europe in the next 5 centuries, and Spain would have been much less important in Europe in the next 5 centuries. But I mean, it's more than we'd have the United States today. We just all talk like the Swedish Chef on the Muppets. It's more than, as I say, how different might have done things, and that leads us to interesting questions like how did they interact with the natives, and which is hard because we don't even really know who the natives were at the time.
They talk about it as being, I guess, like a Thule culture is what they call it archaeologically, but we know very little about who those people were, and we have no idea if they moved further south. Certainly, the Vikings would have been capable of following the coastline. In fact, in some ways, it actually makes a lot of sense that the way that Europe would have found North America would have been by island hopping from Iceland to Greenland. And it seems like ultimately the Vikings talk about it in the sagas as if it was very fertile, awesome land, but it must not have sold all that well in Europe because there wasn't this idea of, oh, we've discovered some beautiful new land that's full of resources. And you wonder why Europe didn't was it just not widely known? It was known at least a little bit because Adam of Bremen, I think, is one who mentioned it. So somebody had heard at least the rumors of where the Vikings were going, and it seems like it could have been.
It sounds like Leif tried to at least sell it as a colony, but it was it was a long way to travel. But the other, when you really talk about it as counterfactual, say, was that realistic? Because the entire population of Viking Greenland was a couple thousand. And while they were overpopulated for what you can do in Viking Greenland, which, by the way, it sounds more and more like a game of Civ, but how big can that city get when there's white tundra all around it? It. But so, did they have the population to do what the Spanish did or what the English finally did? Did they have this large, demanding population, especially since we're talking here really at the Viking period when they're being hit by the European diseases, right? Smallpox and plague. And so, their population just wasn't that large. And they weren't a unified people at this time either. And so it's not really realistic to argue that they would have. Matter of fact, I think it's believable that the Meadows was the only place that they ever stayed with any period of time. They used that as a base camp, and they went out and did some trading and caught some salmon. And maybe there weren't any others. That might have been the biggest city that the Vikings ever had on the North American continent. Now, there's reason to believe there could have been much more because not only was that there, but it would be very difficult to find it archaeologically. Did they have even the population to have done that, even if they had the will and the interest? Probably not. But the evidence seems to indicate when Europeans first showed up, they had relatively friendly relationships at the start. That quickly turned into hostile relationships, and it seems like that's the same thing that was happening to the Norse. Maybe it would have been the same conquest. We just we'd have different colored beards, or maybe being a trading people, maybe they would have had a more friendly interaction. That would not have resulted in the conquest of North America. That might have resulted in a European living side by side with Native Americans in a much friendlier way than we ended up.
One of the reasons that might be possible is because they have smaller numbers of people. So they're not necessarily these colonies that are growing and expanding. And so maybe if the Vikings were more willing to have limited people essentially in these places and use them primarily as trading posts. Maybe something even along the lines of like the French fur trading posts, that maybe there's just you have this connection, but you don't have the burning of Jamestown kind of thing, just because they don't feel as threatened. On the other hand, these were very different cultures, and that's part of why we fought in the in the 1700s, and maybe it would have been exactly the same in 1000 AD, and they just would have fought. It does, like, if we were talking conquest of North America happens 500, 600 years before
Columbus,
before it did. I don't know what that changes, because it doesn't seem, I mean, it ultimately seems like whether smallpox and stuff arrives in 1000 AD or in 1492, it's going to have a dramatic impact on the population. And of course, I mean, if it happens in 1000 AD, you're talking about, killing earlier generations. Of course, that has some kind of huge impact
potentially,
that is almost impossible to measure, since we know very little about the individuals who would have been here between 1000 and 1500.
Yeah, you wouldn't guess they would have better resistance to smallpox. I mean,
no.
So the reason that the Vikings touching North America did not lead to the massive impacts of the Columbian exchange and the disease and all that sort of thing was that their touch was so light, that there were so few of them, they didn't encounter enough Native Americans. Though it was, this was the smallpox period, so it does seem strange, even if they were meeting I guess in Canada they prefer the term First Nations, but if you were meeting Indigenous people, you would have been exposing them to those European illnesses. But maybe those were even such isolated pockets that it didn't go anywhere. So it's a fair point to say that much of, for good or bad, because you can talk all you want about the Columbian exchange, because it also brought medicine and metalworking, and I mean, there's reasons why it wasn't necessarily entirely negative, and we've had that conversation on other channels before, that much of the negative part of the Columbian exchange, which was the trading of disease, would have occurred if it had been Vikings in greater number, or Norsemen in greater number than
I think
the same as if it was Spaniards.
I do think that to put this in into context, at least the description that we have of the initial colonization of Greenland is that 25 ships set out and only 10 made it. So the Viking ships at the time were the height of technology, but for them to make such large over ocean voyages, especially in seas that are full of ice and prone to storms, certainly it's not surprising that the initial colonization and very infrequent travel would eventually have led to people saying, this is not much. This kind of leads into another counterfactual. What if the Vikings land on shore and they discover gold or some other extraordinarily valuable natural resource?
Oh, that's true.
Even with, as we saw in the 1800s in America, people would load up into wagons and cross, thousands of miles, or they would get on a steamer ship and brave an overland route over Central America that was certainly not easy and quite lethal quite often.
A handful of Spaniards did an awful lot because they saw gold and silver. And so I guess that's a fair point. If they had found more than timber and salmon, would they have perhaps been a lot more aggressive?
Yeah, because that's essentially that equation of how valuable is it, right? And then if it's timber and salmon, that only weighs the scale so much. But
well, I mean, it's interesting because if they had to abandon Viking Greenland, then arable land would have seemed to have been very, very valuable to them.
Yeah.
But also potentially at that point they were simply easier places to get that than going all the way to this unknown land.
There is some question about how the climate changed. They'll talk about that being during the medieval warm period. What I was reading about it kind of suggests we're not really sure just how profound an impact that had on, like, the arable land in Greenland, or how much ice that meant that there wasn't in the water. It's possible that they were essentially in a very short period where it was simply easier to get to Greenland than it would have been 100 years before or after.
Yes, I know there was some, because part of the idea is that the little ice age had made the land not arable anymore. But they did some excavation, I believe, and what they really found is that their food supply shifted.
Yeah,
they were eating a lot more seafood, but they seem to have stayed well fed throughout, even though they were not as able to raise livestock. So I think the idea that they simply economically, they weren't. If all that you're getting up there is walrus tusks, and suddenly the demand for walrus tusks has collapsed because of Africa, then I think that's probably a better explanation. But yeah, it might be. It simply might be if it's too cold to get to Greenland, then it's too cold to get all the way over to Vinland.
Yeah. They clearly didn't find any land that they thought was. I mean, just they didn't find the gold. They didn't find this land that they were like, this is worth living here just to live here. There was clearly you have to be able to. Well, I mean, maybe that's you have to be able to make a living wherever you are, right? And that's
Yeah.
if you can't do that.
I mean, the Greenland group didn't seem to go there for anything other than they wanted land. Because the people
True.
that that Eric the Red was able to recruit, were people who had marginal land in Iceland.
Yeah.
And they were coming there for better land. So you would think that there was so much land, but of course, they get here and they find other people already living on that land. Maybe that was why it is. We know that their relations with indigenous people that they ran into were usually ended up hostile. And one of the other explanations for what happened to the Greenland colonies was that the Inuit were migrating south. They called them Skraelings, and that might have been conflict. I mean, I would imagine that they had the same, when they're calling them Skraelings, and they kind of portray them as being some sort of demon or something like that. I'd imagine that's the same reason that people thought Vikings were particularly tall when you're in conflict with someone. So it might have simply been, why do you want to go, where there's orcs? When there's these terrifying native people that you can't quite understand, who can be, quite violent. Why would you do that when there was other places where you could find your arable land?
There's very little evidence they ever went further south, which I think is interesting, because you think they would have found better land, maybe, but.
I mean, there's people that will tell you. Matter of fact, we'll get some comments here. I think they were in Wisconsin or whatever. But the archaeologists tend to say there is nothing that can be archaeologically verified really south of the meadows. Those, I mean, the rune stones or the coins or stuff like that are at least doubtful. Of course, we all know they were burying gold or something on Oak Island, but that's different.
Oh,
That's true.
And, when I was at Chichen Itza, there is a panel somewhere that appears to show men with beards, and the idea is that the Mayans did not grow facial hair, and therefore these must be bearded Europeans, and so they've used that as possible evidence of these were Vikings that reached the Maya. I don't find that particularly convincing myself, but
there's a lot of runes that are interpreted different ways. I think they found helicopters and spaceships too, so it's kind of hard to say. Yeah. But if a dude can come from Sweden and be trading with Byzantium or Arab, down the Volga, I mean, they were hardy people who went very long distances. So I mean, who was there? Was there a Norseman who just kept rowing his boat as long as he could see shore? It's kind of hard to imagine that they made it all the way down to Central America and got carved into a stone wall.
Right. But maybe not impossible.
Maybe not impossible. I mean, they would lots of crazy people went lots of crazy places before, earlier than we thought that they could. And so that is an interesting question. Now, of course, that Labrador, Newfoundland area, that is one of the areas that's always been a hotspot. We always know where Sasquatch live. And so it's possible, of course, that those were the Skraelings. It's possible that really what happened to the Vikings was they didn't want to fight those 9-foot-tall beasts, and that's what terrified them away. I don't think we can discount that.
We can these facts cannot be ignored.
It cannot be, because this was as squatchy a place as you might be, and who knows what the Squatch population was in 1000 CE, in Newfoundland. Might have been quite high. Yeah.
Maybe that was their golden era, and that's when they were most numerous.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, back to Greenland. I do want to throw in a few things. First of all, we have some really interesting parallels between this week's episode and last week's episode. And that is a group of adventurous men travel to a wild frontier in search of XYZ. And in this case, in Greenland, I think that initially what happened, I think that Eric the Red sold Greenland as, okay, hey, all of you guys who are down here with me on the northern end of Iceland, on the land that just the only reason we got it was because no one else had taken it already because it was, pretty marginal. Let's go find some new farmland. And then they rapidly discovered that, oh, hey, wait a second. Instead of beaver pelt, they found walrus tusks. Mm-hmm. And what I have read is that the walrus tusk ivory trade from Greenland back through Norway was substantial.
And how many walrus must have been there? Yeah, because you find them throughout Europe. So, I mean, and again, that goes away when they start getting ivory from Africa. But that's a fair point. Of course, Greenland not squatchy, no trees, so it wouldn't have been. I don't know what maybe had nasty walruses, but
where would Squatch have hidden?
Squatch Russ.
You know,
But,
now I'm imagining Sasquatch riding on the walruses, and this is
This becomes a far more intimidating and potentially violent outcome.
if I were a Viking in Greenland and I see some kind of giant ape riding on a walrus,
I'd leave too. Yeah, you're right. Like, oh,
galumphing down the
we gotta go. We gotta
the
go.
beach.
Yeah. So, and then, yeah, I can see, by the way, a very reasonable explanation for why Greenland, especially after the walrus ivory trade dried
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
And it is also extraordinarily possible, as you've said, 25 ships sailed to Greenland, only 10 made it. If only 10 or 15 sailed away from Greenland with those final hardy families who said, yeah, we're toughing out, but not anymore. Okay, everyone.
Right.
Because
the storm comes.
the colonies, the colonies are stripped of anything valuable.
Yeah.
There's, you do not find the sorts of things that you would associate finding if someone had been overrun by a native population. You don't find
clearly
hoards
abandoned.
of coins. You don't find houses still full of the belongings. It appears as if they basically had packed up and were ready to move.
Yeah, it seems like they abandoned it. It's so strange that all the sagas talk about where they went and don't talk about them coming back. Because there's a saga even talks about just a couple that got married and they went back to Iceland, and you have the whole record of their marriage. So I mean, 2 people come back to Iceland and makes a saga, and 2,000 come back from Greenland, and no one says anything. So, but it's totally believable that the entire population of Viking Greenland, when they decided to leave, died in a storm. I mean, that's quite possible. Yeah. I sincerely doubt it had anything to do with Sasquatches riding walruses, because you think they wouldn't have lasted 200 years if that was going on, right?
Well, unless
they all would have died out much quicker.
Yeah, unless they were very extraordinarily tough Vikings who were able to face such fear.
Well, if we're thinking like Beowulf, a Sasquatch riding a walrus can't be scarier than Grendel.
Oh, that's true.
I don't think so.
Yeah, Grendel could have been a Sasquatch. I mean, that's a fair point.
Yeah. Now, this I think is the most interesting counterfactual that we've come up with on all of the episodes we've discussed so far. Was Grendel in fact Sasquatch?
Was Grendel Sasquatch? We don't know who wrote Beowulf. Maybe as opposed to an Anglo-Saxon epic poem, it actually is a Sasquatch
maybe
epic poem, and
captured from the Sasquatch. Yeah, so there was their epic story, and then the Vikings stole that.
There is one of the interesting things, I think, if you imagine that after the Little Ice Age, that some separated group of Greenlandic Vikings, or even they go to Newfoundland or somewhere in Canada there and manage to continue surviving. It's possible that if they were able to, survive in any sense, I mean, they had Christianity, but they would have had a separated, possibly strange version of Christianity compared to Roman Catholicism. I wonder, if you have something like that, what that might have looked like, because it certainly seems possible that, if they were hardy enough, they could have survived in some small pocket, but it would have been difficult. I mean, it would have been a hardy existence.
Well, and if it was a small group over 500 years, they might have simply bred with the native population to the point where they were indistinguishable, right?
Yeah,
very possible.
Another consideration would be just how large of a group is this, and what skills and learning do they have they can pass on. I mean, if a boatload of primarily farmers and timber cutters land and somehow become stranded, and this group does not have anything better than what the indigenous people have, for instance, the ability to work iron. Working iron in this day and age is certainly not it's not an easy task. It is a very specialized skill, and your best weapon makers and best blacksmiths are probably not coming along for a voyage, or perhaps you do convince one to come along for the voyage because you do need someone who can periodically, pound out a nail or, create some small piece of iron that's necessary to keep the ship afloat. However, especially if they land in an area where there is not an iron supply, what else do the Vikings bring? because once their initial stash of iron weapons deteriorate over time, then suddenly you're back to the more or less the same technological level as the indigenous peoples, and then you end up going native. And interestingly, become perhaps the progenitor of the odd red-haired Native American from the east coast of Canada. And
Yeah.
everyone's trying to figure out,
There's
wait a second, where did the red hair come from?
Where did that come from? And it's certainly, there's no records in the sagas of anything like interbreeding, but it's certainly not impossible.
Well, and as we all know, a ship full of sailors who haven't seen a woman in a while, they have some rather interesting motivations, and you would assume that if there were women available, that there would probably be an attempt to, either capture them or to make more friendly relations or more diplomatic relations, if you will.
It's interesting. I've not heard of any studies that have shown that there's any kind of Norse DNA, but I'm also this might have been small enough that you wouldn't pick it up in populations very easily. And of course, after smallpox hit hundreds of years later, maybe that just wipes out enough people that it's totally absent in the population anyway. In terms of the best case scenario I could see if the Vikings coming were to benefit the Native Americans, the only thing I could really see is that smallpox travels around enough during, those 500 years that the population that is left has enough immunity that when the Spanish show up, it doesn't wipe out in the same way. And if they're able to bring, if they were able to bring something like ironworking, maybe suddenly the Europeans showing up later would be seeing something very different possibly. But you're right, that would have been a difficult thing to carry with you.
There was a forge at the Meadows, though. There's evidence of a forge at the Meadows. So
that's true.
It seems almost peculiar that ironworking didn't work its way more into the population.
Because even if the Native Americans had, even if they hadn't picked up smallpox, if they had picked up, iron forging, and that spread across the whole continent, we found that the trading was remarkably complex, and that the trade networks were moving stuff very far across.
Now we're back to a
North
game
and
of
South
Civ.
America.
When another civilization comes, steals your tech.
Yeah,
you work for it. And
suddenly. Yeah. They were throwing sticks and stones, and now suddenly they've got tanks.
They still ironworking. They still armor. They still armor. They had phalanxes. But no, I don't know. People played the game. But it would seem that would have been extraordinary enough. That's one of the things that natives would have been interested in. They have every reason to think that they were trading. They're just not quite sure what they were trading and with whom. So, it's interesting because if they were spreading that technology, you think it would have spread further. But once again, what we know about the Meadows is that it was occupied for maybe 20 years, maybe 10 over a period of 30 years, that it was occupied seasonally. Yeah. It's not a very large site, so maybe the touch was just very, very light. Only a few people, meeting only a few people. And so we didn't get anything like the Columbian Exchange.
It's tantalizing as far as the counterfactuals go.
Oh yeah.
To imagine what those changes could have brought from something like a Viking kingdom that exists there for centuries to something like some kind of Native Americans that have their culture changed from that interaction. And it's clear. It's very clear that whatever that connection was, it wasn't long, was not so significant. We don't find any trace of, Norse words in any of those languages or any kind of place names. And it just never truly felt like there was enough opportunity in Greenland. Since he had to, and he admits he had to, kind of greenwash, if you will, the idea of living in Greenland. You think that Eric knew from the beginning that it was not necessarily the best land. It maybe wasn't much more, much less marginal than what they were already living in Iceland. They were used to cold land where you had short growing seasons and stuff like that. But I think Greenland was probably a step beyond from Iceland and Norway.
Yeah, maybe he already had a reputation, for selling swampland in Florida there, and so then he couldn't sell them on Vinland. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the.
Well, You wouldn't say that Labrador and Newfoundland are the places
No.
that you would first choose to settle in North America
Yeah.
if that was your choice.
There are very few retirement communities
I, don't-
based
I
out
don't mean to insult.
based out of
I don't mean to
the
insult anyone,
wonderful.
but
No.
it's clearly pretty darn cold where they were. It would have been easy if you were just doing that
Yeah,
in a
the
longhouse.
sagas talk about it. Like
Yeah.
when they found Vinland, they're like it was paradise. I'm like, well, if it was truly paradise, maybe we would have spent more time there. But
Maybe would have gotten more people.
yeah,
But I mean, there's a reason, they found rune stones and coins and stuff that
Yeah.
people have argued meant the Vikings made it all the way down to the Great Lakes and stuff like that. No archaeologist is, or archaeology is very much unconvinced by that.
yeah,
But you can see why people are willing to believe it, because if you understand what hardy people the Vikings were, it's kind of hard to imagine that they found the coast, and that not one of them said, I want to go see where this coast ends. I mean, because this whole story is someone's boat blew south and they saw some land, and
Yeah.
2 generations later, someone's like, I want to go see what that is. So I mean, they're very curious people. They are mighty seamen. They are very, of course, hardy if they're living in Greenland. So how far down the coast did some boat go, and how much evidence would they have left behind if they did? And apparently not enough to convince anybody for sure that they had. But I mean,
Yeah.
it's I guess not inconceivable that they wound up in Chichen Itza, right?
well, and if they were extremely small numbers of people, which ultimately that's what we're talking about. If Greenland
Yeah.
was the big city of
Yeah.
what the Vikings left here, that you could be talking, just one guy who's interested, but so many of them could have gone off and, I mean, touched some really incredible places that we would be surprised if we knew for sure they went there. And then just, their boat sank and they died in the North Atlantic somewhere before they told anybody.
Yeah, they never made it into a saga. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I mean, the saga was written and lost. Or I mean, but
No.
I mean, even if they traded, even say some metal objects.
Yeah.
I mean, if you got a boat with 20 guys, 40 guys, how much could they have carried with them, and how much could that have impacted all of the continent and the population?
Yeah, if you think about it, the Viking boats. Now, obviously they've got at least two different type of craft, and of course these craft are handmade, so there's variants and probably hybrids as well. But these are not huge ocean-going vessels with deep
No, they're no for their
keels.
light keels. Yeah.
In fact, part of the reason that they're so fearsome in battle is because these relatively low keeled or high keeled ships actually that don't go very far into the water, suddenly become able to row up the Seine to wonderful places that have amenities and riches, which is where a lot of Europeans discovered that these ships are very, 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 very good, not only in the open ocean. Well, they're okay on the open ocean, but they are very good.
Well, and the
at getting up
Vikings proved
rivers.
that, over and
That's
over
true,
again. One of
Plus-
the things that might have impacted them coming back to Europe, honestly, is stuff like the plague, which reduced some of the population pressure that sent people to Greenland in the first place.
Mhm.
There's, of course, it's hard to know exactly why they left Greenland. We've offered a lot of possible reasons for why those settlements didn't last. But if you're feeling like Greenland is somewhat marginal and suddenly, the plague has wiped out some of the people back in Iceland, you think, oh, well, maybe I can go get some of that
that's
land.
true, maybe so yeah. If you're talking
That's closer to civilization.
overpopulation in Greenland, it's not going to be a big population push. Even if you're overpopulated in Greenland, how many how many people that going to be in such small settlements? So it's true. It might have been easier to look back towards Iceland and saying, a lot of those people who had the better land are now dead, and
Yeah.
it will go. It's just easier for us to go there.
Yeah, and with a lot of the family connections, because essentially everyone who went to the initial Greenland colony seems to have come from
You're right, yeah.
Iceland.
But I mean, these guys would show, a thousand
So-
boats would show up on the shore of England, and these guys would dump out huge numbers. So I mean, we know that they had the capacity to send very large fleets when they really felt like it, and England certainly felt that. So I mean, was this just too far?
No, I think that it's the motivation. The reason that you have these incredible raids that are coordinated into England, Ireland, Brittany, or Normandy, as well as points further away, is because the Vikings found something there to raid. So in Ireland, it was easily conquered monasteries that were full of gold, silver, and other portable wealth. Uh, Same thing with England to an extent. And England had an added benefit that its climate was quite a bit better than
Yes.
Yeah.
Greenland, Iceland, Norway,
Imagine where you're
Sweden.
from if you think the climate in
Um,
Scotland.
But that's
This
if
is paradise. It
if
only rains 6 days a week.
right. If Greenland looks okay to you, then Scotland
Scotland's
is a
like, oh,
paradise. That's
this is balmy.
it, now I have to wonder, what did the first Viking who ever tried haggis think?
yeah. There was some
Admittedly.
cultural differences there too. You wonder if they went to Newfoundland and found like true like really civilization that had gold and stuff like that they could raid. Uh, that's a lot easier than having to cut down all the
Yeah.
trees first.
Yeah, and it might have been, I mean, might have been a very fierce people that they ran into who were used to living, like they lived in Greenland. I mean, you used to have to fight bears for your
Yeah.
food. And so,
You have to imagine that it was sparse.
yeah,
I mean,
very
this
sparsely built,
that was not easy land to live in, and obviously people did. I mean,
they did, yeah.
there were always
So, and I mean, there's sign that there were people living there 4,000 years before they
yeah
showed up. But I mean, how much? Yeah, it was probably a transient population, probably a hunter-gatherer sort of population, probably a low population density population. So, there at some point though, if they were trading, someone understood each other's languages enough to do that. I mean, there might have been a Viking that spoke, is it Micmac
yeah.
up there or whatever? I'm not sure what even language we'd be talking about. I'll probably get in trouble even for saying that, but. I mean,
I'm not sure if we know
if we know, but
exactly
I mean,
what.
that there was a Viking who spoke the native tongue, and that there were natives who spoke enough of the Norse tongue to be able to go and trade, beaver pelts for iron or whatever they were trading for. So I mean, it's an interesting time. I would love to go visit. I don't know if it's necessarily on my bucket list, but it's on the list of things I'd love to do is to go up and visit the meadows.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting archaeological site. But I mean, there's still so much you don't know about what was going on there and how they were interacting and who they were interacting with. So it does again leave a lot of room for counterfactual. But I mean, for there to be a significant counterfactual, you'd had to have a whole lot more Vikings, a whole lot more Norsemen than ever seems to have ever been available for this adventure.
I would actually argue that you
Mhm.
needed something that they would go after. Again, if there's gold, if the Skraelings that they meet are wearing gold jewelry, the King of Norway, I can pretty much guarantee, will, hey, those 600 ships that we have going to conquer Wessex, we haven't found gold in Wessex. I would think that there would be definitely a change. They would do a pivot to try to
That's
to try to
I mean,
exploit
that's
that.
the interesting
So
counterfactual is if they find something there, and the Vikings, move in force. I mean, they might do what they did in England, in Newfoundland, but it seems like what we're talking about there is we're starting to change some things that you're just not sure will change. Would they have found gold? Was there any way? Did those peoples have significant amounts of gold? Did they value that the way that Europeans did? And I mean, if the Vikings had seen the Aztec Empire or the Mayans, maybe they would have done exactly what the Spanish did. But
Yeah, they didn't have the mindset Potosi here. Yeah, that's true.
yeah,
I think there's maybe iron ore there, though I don't know how easy that would have been to extract.
I don't know how much gold
I think
is
even
in that
today
area,
in
but
Newfoundland and Labrador, I think it's like seafood and I mean, which would have been valuable. I mean, that's another possible counterfactual. But there might have been Portuguese fishermen that were off of the Atlantic coast, centuries ahead of Columbus, fishing off the Grand Banks. I mean, there's some indication of that. They just didn't have any good reason to go to shore out there. I don't know that seafood is going to be a good enough reason to get you to, you're right, to go on some big invasion force.
I do think that we also have, to answer our counterfactual, at least to an extent, we do have an example where the Vikings did land where there was something worth going after. That's a little island called Ireland. And it was interesting how, initially the Vikings came in, they set up cities for the first time in Ireland, which is a contribution that cannot be misstated. And they discovered that there was a rather energetic and not particularly willing to be conquered people there, in addition to very rich abbeys. So The Vikings certainly were adept at establishing colonies there, and they in fact become some of the major urban areas of modern day Ireland. So can we see that perhaps there's a hypothetically Leif Erikson goes and
Hmm.
convinces the King of Norway to send 200 ships and several thousand colonists? Is there this enclave of Vikings who last into the 15th, 16th century, or maybe even up to modern times? And someone gets a rude awakening when they're like, "Oh yes, well we're going to go meet more native people," and it's
Hmm.
like suddenly the native
Yeah.
people
Yeah,
are
that would be
carrying iron
interesting. Yeah.
weapons.
Could have changed things significantly if the Vikings had changed culture enough to make a different level of resistance to Columbus, as well as, like you said, what if
Yeah.
they'd had resistance to some of these diseases?
Yeah. What if they, what if they're living in Canada and, of course, they don't know necessarily anything about the stuff
Oh
far,
yeah.
far south that the Spanish eventually discover. But when the era of colonization starts, suddenly, the Danes or or the combined thrones of Norway, Denmark, and stuff like that. I mean, maybe then suddenly they've got a pretty good claim to North American lands. And if you have say, a Danish Canada instead of a French or an English one, it would be a very different world if instead of when uh, the British arrive, well, English colonists arrive in Boston or at Plymouth, if there's already some European
Mhm.
settlements that are, there's already a
There's some
claim
arguments that
growing
there might
there.
have been Spaniards there already, or I mean that there were blonde kids in the
Also
woods and
true.
stuff like that. We've heard that, but I mean, but the question is how much. I mean, what we
Yeah,
find is that the Norse interaction with the native people looks a lot like the English interaction with the native people and the Spanish interaction with the native people. So
true.
again, it looks very much like it does today. We just all have Norse-sounding names, but yeah, I'm certainly Spain became incredibly important because of the gold that they found in the New World, and or that they were also taking from the Philippines too. But Spain became very, very important because of that money. So what if the Norse had discovered the true great resources of North America? Then the difference might be that those thrones in Denmark and Sweden were as dominant in Europe in a period, as dominant in the world in a period as the Spanish were in the 16th century. And that is, that certainly might make a very different Europe as well.
Yeah, and it's hard to determine exactly how.
It's especially hard to determine because Northern Europe and as we've seen from a couple of episodes ago, Russia. These are places where the lands do not create a huge surplus of food. Supporting large populations is
Yeah.
pretty much not in the cards. It's a geographic and environmental reality. So, does a relatively small population northern bloc come to power, and do they dominate Spain, or perhaps they have deeper inroads into Germany, or into Central Europe, Central and Western Europe, which we consider to be Germany and parts of France. Do we get a super state at one point where the Norse language is lingua franca, if you will, as opposed to, well, France dominating Central Europe at that time, and it became lingua
I mean,
franca.
that's the kind of stuff that could change uh, with maybe relatively little nudging. But if it is true that I think of as we've had this conversation, a big part of what we've seen is that maybe there just wasn't a reason for that connection to grow yet. And that's why even though it seems like maybe that would be the easier route to North America,
Yeah,
why it
they didn't go
ultimately
anywhere. And it's
wasn't.
interesting, given maybe if there had been a lot of gold up in Newfoundland before Europeans arrived, then the natives might not have cared, right? I mean, so that could
Yeah.
be interesting because you could have still a sparse population, and have the Europeans show up and say, "Ooh, this stuff is really, really valuable," and that could have changed everything. It might not even just have been Norsemen coming there, but I mean, if that word had spread to other parts of Europe, then maybe there's a lot coming. So maybe it's a coincidence that I mean, but it's not to say that Newfoundland's without resources. But I mean, maybe the demand
No.
for timber and cod isn't it just isn't enough to send fleets after. It's kind of funny then what we value when you think about that because you need timber and cod to live, And yeah, we'd pack
Yeah.
the fleets off for this relatively soft metal.
Yeah. However, you cannot fill your wallet with timber and cod, or a very small boat with sufficient quantities to really make it that
Hmm.
valuable, as opposed to walrus tusk, where you can you can put thousands into a longboat.
Yeah, bundle up. It still makes you wonder how many walruses were there and how many of them that they killed. But that's a fair point. Yeah. I mean, if they were going to Vinland for timber, I don't know how much timber they're carrying back. You're right. I mean, how big's the boat?
Yeah, you can assume that they probably created a raft with the timber, drug it behind the boats, and that there's another good reason that they didn't want to go back, was because dragging a large raft of timber, or loading your boat with a limited amount of timber, and sailing to and from, what's the payoff on
Yeah, it's got to
that?
be more
Um,
dangerous
and
too.
it,
You're risking your life more by trying to drag the wood behind you, and then if you end up having to ditch it, then you have nothing to show for your
Then you have
for your
nothing. Yeah.
dangerous journey.
But you don't want to go down
Yeah.
with your wood, right? Yeah.
I mean, that might be part. It
yeah,
might have partially been that the technology wasn't there for them to make that valuable, because we were just talking ships, not even close to what we'd be talking about by the time that Columbus came across. That those were very different ships, and it was still a very
yeah,
dangerous journey in Columbus's ships.
yeah, and even as we see in shipwrecks worldwide, what the ships are usually crammed to the gills with is something valuable. So, some of the wrecks off of Southeast Asia, they're full of fine chinaware, which at the time was a very high
Hmm.
demand item. Many of
Hmm.
the Spanish, the galleons, of course, were full of gold and silver and probably some additional stuff, but
Jewels, yeah,
they weren't shipping large
gemstones.
quantities of mangoes,
No.
or, or timber back to Spain. It was the portable
Yeah.
wealth, so silver,
Yeah.
gold, gems, spices,
Yeah.
obviously, because those are relatively low density, high value
It's
items.
actually the British colonies ended up changing a little bit. The British idea was that they would get the raw materials like timber from the American colonies and bring that to the UK where they would then build it. But that had a lot to do with this idea of mercantilism, and the kind of these ideas that they built. What their empire should be like, but those were new ideas, and they also were kind of necessitated from the fact that some people were finding some kingdoms were finding Tenochtitlan, and England found Massachusetts, which just didn't have
Hmm.
they were trying to get whatever value they could, and you could say to some extent that the British never really did get what they wanted out of the American colonies.
It was a while before we found gold. Yeah.
I would say that one exception to that would probably be tobacco.
That's fair.
I
That
do
did
believe that
alter.
tobacco was a very highly sought after crop, and again, fairly portable, fairly dense. So a hold full of
Yeah.
tobacco certainly had quite a bit of
And
value.
early in the that colonial period, that was essentially what was sustaining. I mean, many of the colonies was purely on tobacco.
Yeah, and the tobacco trade went all the way through easily through the
Yeah.
19th into the 20th century. So yeah, tobacco's always been a big cash crop. So the final question I think we should address is: was Eric the Red aided by aliens in his trip? Did they perhaps drop a compass to him?
See, if he had a compass, it would have made it a lot easier. Now the question is, what were the aliens trying to do by getting him to Greenland, and did they accomplish it, or did it all fall apart?
They
My
picked him up when
theory,
they put him back. They put him on the wrong side of the water there. But I mean, the Vikings had the sunstones, which were like amazing technology for the time. Their navigational skills seemed to exceed what most people were able to do at the time. And there's some, question how did they come by that technology that so changed everything?
yeah, and actually, to be fair, a compass is not a good example, because there is some evidence that they had magnetized needles that they would put into a bowl of water, and
Yeah.
that actually worked as a compass. But yes, I think the highly believable story is that the aliens gave Eric the Red the technology so that the Vikings would go to Greenland, so that they could 400 years later be kidnapped. And
true.
that's what happened to the.
That is one of the many things that people will argue about what happened to the Greenland. Whenever anybody goes missing, then of course aliens is. I hadn't thought about that. If they were kidnapped by Sasquatch, why? Maybe the Greenland Vikings were kidnapped by aliens, and maybe they'll come back.
That's
or something like that.
That could make a great story. The 14th century Vikings
history, yeah.
that are suddenly returned.
Yeah, and some sort of space version of a longboat. Yeah, there's a book in the writing there. Someone's gonna steal that idea and turn that into a $1 million idea. I don't know that aliens is necessarily the answer, but we do know that the aliens work hand in hand with the Sasquatch, so it's possible that it was all
as is known as historical fact.
That's
the alien Sasquatch alliance.
I just kind of as an aside, kind of the elephant in the room that maybe we haven't discussed is, why is it that the Vikings are really the only wide-ranging seafaring people in the Atlantic at this point?
Yeah, that's a fair
point. This definitely,
this
is long before the British Navy rules the waves.
And, there might have been people fishing off of the Grand Banks at this point or whatever, but you're right. I mean, in much more ancient times, they're taking boats around the Horn of Africa, and they're taking boats in that. I mean, there's explorers that are going all over the place. Why at this period is there no one else trying to cross the ocean? Why is it only the Vikings? And it's a fair question. Again, it might be a matter of Europe distracted by plague, disease, and population has declined, and there's less reason to do that. But it is strange how that kind of explorer mentality goes in waves, and there seems to be 100,000-year periods where no one's really going off to see anything new.
Yeah, comes back to the great man in history. Was Eric the Red inevitable,
or was he a unique figure? Without Eric the Red, is there a Greenland or a Viking Greenland? And I don't know. They had clearly seen it before. No one says that the sagas don't seem to say that Eric was the first one to see it, but he was the first one to have that idea to let's go to it. And maybe that's maybe there wasn't someone else that would have done that. Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow The History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.